Party on, party people. I'm your host, JJ, and today we're looking at the Wayne's World video games. All right, I'll drop the voice. But yes, we're looking at the Wayne's World video games. These are on the NES, the Game Boy, and the SNES version, if you want to call it that. And we're going to look at these and see if any of them are worth playing. I spent an entire stream over on Twitch playing them for 8 hours to get enough footage and to play through them. I did play through all of them. And so we're going to take you through my thoughts and tell you guys if any of these are worth checking out. Here we go.
Swing! Swing!
And for this video, I'm going to do things a little bit differently. I know I normally just go in alphabetical order, but I think in this specific instance, I do want to go worst to best. And part of the reason I think it'll be interesting in this case is because I think I'm going to take some people off guard with what I'm about to say. After having played all of them, I finished them, played, basically 8 hours of these games for this video. I genuinely believe that the SNES version, the one released for the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, is the worst version of the game. And I know, you would think with a later release date and 16-bit console architecture that that would be the best version of the game, but unfortunately, due to some pretty major flaws in the gameplay, that is just simply not the case. I think this is the least fun version. Before we get into why that is, I do want to say that there are some positives to this game. First of all, I think visually, the game is actually quite nice. I think not only are the level aesthetics not bad, although maybe a little busy. I think they could have toned down how much visual information they put in these levels. I do think overall the actual sprite work and design is pretty good, as well as Wayne's character model. I think even though it's got this like kind of strange caricature-esque style look to it, I think it kind of fits the tone of the films. I did get a lot of people saying that he looked really creepy, and I can't blame anyone for thinking that. He does look a little weird, but I don't know. I've kind of always liked that kind of caricature style. For me, it works. It might not work for everybody. And I also think having Wayne have his guitar as his main method of attack, his axe, if you will, with like these sonic blast attacks that he does, it's very 16-bit. It's of its era. It's very video gamey, but I think it works in this particular case, and I actually quite liked it. Now, the problems in a bad game really don't show themselves in the visuals very often, at least not usually. Really, what happens is when you go to play them, the cracks start to show, and this is no exception. Unfortunately, it's a number of different design choices that make this game probably one of the most frustrating games I have ever tried to play, and I've played a lot of frustrating games. This is among the worst, and I can't be alone because even just playing through it for stream and for this video, I got so many comments that said I've never seen past the first level. Like, most people that try this really struggle with it, even people that have been playing games a lot. Now, I don't claim to be some great platforming master. In fact, it's one of the genres I'm kind of weaker at, honestly. I've played enough of them to usually be able to do okay. In this game, I had to resort to save stating quite a bit. So I want to say, first of all, sorry, Denis, our editor, for having to work around all of that, but I did what I had to do in order to see this game through. Like I said, there's a few different reasons as to why this game is so tough, but I think the biggest one I can pinpoint is not necessarily the level designs in terms of like the visuals, but it's the level layouts. If you were to draw these levels on a map, the problem would become very immediately apparent. Essentially, you have these crazy maze-like designs, and a lot of it is just zigzagging back and forth down levels, and then you'll loop back around, zigzag up, go back, and basically rinse and repeat. And obviously, like the amount of zigzagging changes, the amount of vertical versus horizontal, it makes it extremely hard to get through these levels. There is very little sense of direction. There's no arrows or signs pointing you where to go. You're just kind of expected to figure this stuff out, and it's especially bad when you start getting into some of the areas with like trampolines, like in the music area, for example. They have these snare drums and bongos you can bounce on, and suddenly it's like you're getting all this vertical height and you're just like, okay, well, where do I go next? That is the biggest issue with this. And that wouldn't be bad enough if lives weren't a factor, but you also have very limited hit points. You get 5 to start. You can grab more in the levels, but they're pretty few and far between. And just because of the level design and because you're poking around trying to find, you like almost in a maze, you're trying to find that route that gets you to the end, you end up hitting a lot of dead ends and you have to turn around and then come back and then go a different route. Of course, there's enemies in all these areas, so you're gonna get hit. It's gonna happen. With only limited hit points, poking around in places where you're not making any progress, only having 5 hit points, you're gonna die. And there are no checkpoints in any of the segments of these levels. Once you are dead, you're back at the start and you got to do it all again. It makes these levels impossible because these are long levels. Like, even if you know what you're doing and where to go, I mean, they can still take 15, 20, 25 minutes. They aren't short levels by any means. That is really just a concoction of bad ideas all thrown together, and it makes this game incredibly hard to play. Really, the only upshot to this game is honestly seeing how weird it gets and also how it sort of nods to the source material of the movie. If you're able to brute force your way through it with save states, or God forbid you try to learn the levels well enough to not die, I am going to take you through, I guess you could call this the spoiler section. I'm going to show you guys what this game has to offer in each of the areas. Obviously, in the first area, I didn't even mention the just insane enemy designs here, right? I mean, it's total random 16-bit era video game enemy designs. It's like, let's just make any inanimate object an enemy. So in the music area, you get all these musical instruments that want you dead. You got tubas, you got bagpipes, guitars, I mean, you name it. Just ridiculous enemies, right? Of course. The final boss in that area, which has nothing to do with musical instruments, is like this weird robot snake. I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, the second area is a donut shop. You get, of course, donuts and a bunch of other tasty sweets and pastries attacking you, as well as like teacups and stuff. And the final boss in that area is a donut monster that can shoot like red orbs. I don't know if they're supposed to be like cherries or M&Ms or I don't know, whatever they are. The third area is Gasworks, and that's the concert venue from the movie. In addition to an even more absurd assortment of enemies, you also have Stacy just going, "Hi, Wayne," like constantly. It's something.
Hi, Wayne. Hi, Wayne. Hi, Wayne.
But yeah, you get like Kiss heads, like Gene Simmons style heads, these painted heads floating around. Probably the weirdest enemy, and there's really no explanation as to why. They have the yellow submarine from the Beatles, Yellow Submarine. It just floats around randomly and shoots torpedoes at you. Also, it makes one of the absolute most horrifying sounds in a video game I think I've ever heard. I'm not kidding. In that area, you get like an Elvis wannabe impersonator as a boss, and you fight him off. And then in the last area is really where things tie together. You've probably noticed that we've been playing as Wayne the whole game. That's for a reason. We're actually trying to save Garth. And for some reason, the last area is like a suburbia if all the houses were pulled out of the ground and floating 1,000 feet up in the air for no reason. Anyway, you get to the end of it, and there's Garth, and he's in a giant purple gelatinous cube, which is a pretty funny nod to those that know from the movie. I thought it was a clever use of things, but honestly, the boss fight itself, not very interesting. So that pretty much shows you everything you need to know from the SNES and Genesis versions of Wayne's World. I did use footage from the SNES version because honestly, the color palette was just significantly better. Really, the Genesis version is the same game, but with a big hit in the color zone. So that being said, I can't really recommend this one. It's got some fun nods, but unfortunately, the gameplay is just really unfun and was one of the hardest things to get through that I've played in a while. So for that reason alone, I'd have to give this like a 1.5 Waynes out of 5. Now for my second place pick. I know this kind of gives you the idea for what first is going to be once I say this, but once again, you're probably going to be surprised. For second place, I got to go with the NES version of the game. And now this one's an interesting one because it's not only a late release, this was 1993, which is pretty late for the original Nintendo. The Super Nintendo was out in 91, so kind of surprising we got an NES game in 93, but hey, I mean, there were still people rocking the old Nintendos, you know, parents that maybe didn't want to upgrade their kid to a Super. There was a market for it. You will notice, though, this was done by Radical Entertainment, which is probably a name that sounds familiar if you've played like Simpsons Hit and Run. It really kind of came into their own, I think, in the early to mid 2000s. In the late 80s, early 90s, they were still kind of finding their footing, and I think just looking at this game, it's pretty obvious that this wasn't exactly a highly competitive NES game, especially for 93, and compared to what else was coming out at the time. Visually, it is not where you would expect an NES game to be, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. But yeah, the color palette's pretty limited. The sprite work it's serviceable, but it's basic, and it almost reminds me of what I'd see somebody make in like MS Paint on their computer in the 90s. I know that's a little harsh, but it does give off that kind of aesthetic, and it's a little hard to ignore. The cool thing about this game, and one of the big reasons I'm putting it above the Super Nintendo and Genesis versions, is the fact that Garth is a playable character in this, and I think that was a really good move because, you know, he's kind of a tech whiz, and they actually gave him like a photon blaster in this version of the game, which is actually really fun to use, and it's definitely more engaging, I think, than maybe the guitar attack in the Super Nintendo and Genesis versions. And you all can also upgrade it and get like a multi-directional attack. Pretty fun. It's simple, it gets the job done, but I really enjoyed it. The unfortunate thing about making Garth so cool, though, is it kind of makes Wayne feel like second fiddle, which, I don't know, maybe is comeuppance for Garth. I can kind of get down with it, but honestly, Wayne is definitely the least fun of the two. It's mainly just because he doesn't get any sort of weapon. He just kicks everything. Like, I don't remember him kicking everything in the movies, but apparently for the game, they decided Wayne's just gonna kick everything. So that is your main method of attack for Wayne, the only method of attack. So you better get used to it, and it definitely has some problem spots, especially because a lot of the Wayne levels are the harder levels. You know, there's a section later in the game where you're working through a television studio and they've got spiders coming down from the ceiling. Because they land on the ground, they're really hard to hit with your kick. It's just the hit boxes are a little awkward there, and it definitely makes for some frustrating moments. Overall, I do think this is a more playable game than the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions. It's a little shorter. It does take a similar approach in terms of the locales it tackles, right? You still got the music shop. The donut shop actually becomes kind of a bonus area after each stage, and basically you can collect the donuts, get some health back. If you're able to get all of the donuts, you actually get a 1-up, which is nice because the game, once again, does have limited lives. You start with a handful. Again, the donut shop can get you some more, but it is pretty limited, and I definitely wouldn't blame anyone for using save states here either. I used a couple just to expedite things because there are no continues. Once you go through those handful of lives, you start the whole game over. It's not a very long game if you know what you're doing. Overall, it's pretty fun, but yeah, the limited lives is definitely a bit of a kick in the pants. The final boss is also something I would like to talk about because, as you guys know, Rob Lowe is in the movie. He's kind of an antagonist. You know, he's trying to hit on Cassandra, Wayne's love interest, and he's trying to steal the show from him. As you would expect, the final boss is his character Benjamin, but the character in the final boss area does not look like Rob Lowe. It's not even close. Like, it just looks like generic tough guy. Actually, what's really funny in this version of the game is I managed a couple times to basically get him caught on a couch, and I basically just spam kicked as Wayne until he died. That was it. You get a still frame of Mike Myers going excellent, and it boots you back out to the main menu. That is all you get. Honestly, I found this one way more charming than I maybe should have. I think it's definitely a game that's better than the sum of its parts overall, but does have some flaws. I think one of the bigger flaws is definitely fall damage. I don't know why they felt the need to add that to a game like this, especially because there aren't like crazy drops. I get doing like instant bottomless death pits in certain areas where platforming is tight, but I mean, we're just talking like in the first level, I'd take random fall damage, which is really really strange, especially considering the Game Boy version, which we're going to get into next year. Before we move on here, I'd like to give a quick plug to my merch store, JankedJesus, the shop. We have a brand new design featuring a fun send-up of the Wayne's World logo. We called it Jank's World. I hope you guys like it. You can get it on stickers, mugs, shirts, sweatshirts, you name it. Really like how this one turned out, and there's a whole bunch of other designs that you can check out too. It is a great way to support the stream and the YouTube videos, and lets me continue to do what I do every day for y'all. So thank you for your consideration. The link will be in the description as well as a pinned comment. It is kyletx500.creator-spring.com. And I really do think the Game Boy version is the best version of the game. Now, before anybody yells at me for having not rated the NES version yet, I did that on purpose. I want to make a point, and I think a lot of minds might get blown here. We're going to put footage of the Game Boy version up on screen, and I want you to take a close look. This looks really familiar, right? Well, it should, because this was also done by Radical Entertainment, the same guys that did the NES version. And it turns out, upon further digging and further inspection, that they had actually made this Game Boy version first, and then essentially took the engine, the assets, basically the game, and amped it up, added color, increased the resolution, changed some levels around, and basically tried to pass it off like an NES game. And I think that's where the NES game truly flounders, is it's trying to be something that it's not. This is essentially a Game Boy game. It's like a kid trying to dress up like an adult. It's like you can see right through it. It might be kind of cute. It's kind of interesting, but like you're not fooling anyone here. And so despite that, it does work pretty well. I'm going to be generous and give the NES version a 2.5 Waynes out of 5. I did enjoy it, surprisingly, despite that. But I also want to get into why the Game Boy version is honestly just the better version. And simply, I think more than anything, this is a Game Boy game. It was designed as a Game Boy game. It feels like a Game Boy game, and it's just more at home on this system. Now, it's not to say there aren't specifics, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they just play tested this game on Game Boy, and it feels like what you'd expect from this system at this time, whereas the NES version is just like this weird pseudo monstrosity Frankenstein situation. It's really strange. But yeah, the Game Boy version has some pretty significant differences. First of all, there's no fall damage like the NES version. I don't know why they bothered to add that in after the fact. I guess just to make it harder. A lot of the NES changes actually do just make the game more frustrating. That really is what it comes down to. A lot of the later Wayne stages, for example, the one where you're in the television studio working your way through, there's these screens that basically come out of the CRT and try to attack you. They are way easier to handle in the Game Boy version. It just, once again, it feels like it was play tested for the Game Boy, and whatever conversion they did for the NES just made it harder. Similarly, after that sequence in the NES version, we had basically the pitfalls with spiders section. For the Game Boy version, you actually get a nice little like light switch puzzle section, essentially is what it is. It's kind of a gimmick. I mean, basically you just can't see the platforms while the switch is off. It's a fun diversion, and there's no enemies, so Wayne's kind of mediocre kick isn't as big of a deal in this version. It's just those little things. Also, the outside sequence when you're trying to get to Benjamin's apartment, it's just a little more streamlined. It's more basic, and I honestly think it works in its favor. Ironically, the one downside that this game has over the NES version is that the final boss, Benjamin, once again looks nothing like Rob Lowe, which is what it is. Actually, this version of the boss, it isn't as broken as the NES version, but it's very basic. Essentially, it's all about timing and getting your kicks off and just the spacing of the fight. Once you get that, it's pretty easy. So would you rather have an easy fight that does take some skill, or one that will break and be cheesable? Honestly, the NES version was kind of fun for that reason, but I gotta say the Game Boy one's a little bit more satisfying. Feels like I earned the win more for sure. Overall, I just think the Game Boy version is the supreme reigning champ. That being said, it is not a perfect game by any means. It has a lot of the same problems that the NES version did, but it feels overall like a much more fair experience. And for that reason, I am going to give Wayne's World on the Game Boy 3 Waynes out of 5. Guys, that is it for our Wayne's World breakdown here. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. I can't say I necessarily recommend people go out and play any of these right away. Maybe the Game Boy version if you're curious. I definitely think that is the best one far and away, and the one that I would probably go back and play over the others. So I'd love to hear what you guys have to say down in the comments below. Hopefully you liked this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you want to see more of this stuff happen live, you can check us out over on Twitch. Until then, guys, thanks for watching, and see ya all soon.